Oh, what? Hunter's got a raid buff? Oh my god. It happened. All right, let's get into the juicy stuff. So let's look at this in depth. Hunter's Mark now increases all damage taken by the target by 5% while the target is above 80% maximum health. We like the idea of Hunter's Mark highlighting specific targets on the battlefield, so we have made an adjustment to Hunter's Mark to cause it to increase all damage taken by 5% on targets above 80% health. A quick few notes about this change. When applying it out of combat or before a pull, it continues to have no cooldown. If you apply Hunter's Mark while in combat, Hunter's Mark receives a 20-second cooldown. We don't intend for you to move this damage bonus around frequently. Yeah, that would be very cringe. Like, I guess the idea is you're using this on the pull, and while you're just doing math and you're like, well, 100% of the boss, if you're just doing it for the first 20% and it's a 5% increase, it's going to be a 1% increase. It's going to be a little higher than that because on most bosses, you do far more damage in the first 20% than you do for the rest of the fight because you're popping all of your cooldowns in it. So you're going to get a little bit more value out of that. But I mean, it is still just purely 20%. So if this basically does say, also wait, that's like turbo, not how math works. Wait, I think I had that wrong in my head. I do have that wrong in my head. This is just a 1% increase if it's only per single target. Sorry, NA math. What the f is arithmetic? So yeah, 1% increase on a pure single target sludge fist-like damage boss. Let me do math on that, actually. Let's go to, not statistics for classes, but let's go to, what's like a pure single target? Rashok? No, not statistics, ranking. What the f is a number? Let's see, Rashok. Let's look at, nah, not maybe top BM hunter log. I mean, let's just look. I'll just pick a random Kripa, this guy. So this hunter was blasting Rashok in his guild, right? Okay, so if you were to take his entire raid's DPS, 1.9 mil, 1% of that is it 19k? That's off the top of my head. Okay, if you add 19k to the hunter, he is, well, in this specific log, he's really high, but like, let's look from top to bottom. 19k is the difference between, almost the difference between top and bottom, not including the hunter. So like from this DH to this rogue, almost. It's like right around here. So it's going to make your bar look like that instead of that in reality. What is it? Isn't it 1k DPS per person? I don't know exactly what it would be. I mean, I guess in this exact scenario, that's because you have 20 raid members and you're doing almost 2 million damage, right? So it'll break down like that. It's just going to be whatever 1% of the raid's damage is. You'd have to do some math, but I'm trying to, is this, not to mention it doesn't work in execute phase though. So like if you're doing a fight where your damage at the beginning doesn't actually matter, what the hell are you trying to figure out? I'm trying to figure out if this change means you bring a hunter to all raids in an optimal scenario. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Just like top of my head. Priority adds maybe, depends on the fight. Surely it's encounter specific. It is a bit encounter specific because not every fight is a Magmarax 100-0 burn, a Rashok, right? Like for example, let's say what really held you back on Neltharion was like your damage in the last phase or in P2. This wouldn't be that good. Like, I guess you could use your Hunter's Mark on new adds when you swap to them in P2. You wouldn't do it in P3 at all. You would just be blasting the boss. But like, if the execute phase is what's hard and all of the damage isn't relevant, then it wouldn't really matter. Although they have been doing a good job of that. So like on Sarkareth, it would matter. So Sarkareth doesn't ever phase on a percent. It phases on a time with like, it has a gate for the percent so you don't overkill it. So like on Sarkareth, this would have just absolute full value. Not to mention in P2, you'd be able to throw it on the big ads when they spawn to get even extra value. Max, it should work during execute phase 2. Oh, you think they should change it to be while the target is above 80 and below 20? I'm really looking at it right now. I'd have to look at like a bunch of logs. Because like off the top of my head, giving your raid a 1% damage increase by being in the raid doesn't sound good enough to be like, okay, you play a hunter all the time. But I'm looking at numbers and it makes me think that it definitely is. Like, I'm just like looking at it. So this raid, 2 million raid DPS. And that would be increased by 1% with Hunter's Mark, generally speaking, especially on a boss like Rashok, which would be right around 20k. If you were to add 20k to the lowest DPS in the raid, literally this hunter, fucking Young Money Helmsley, they probably died or something. But like, it takes them from being all the way down here to middle of the pack, like right before it jumps up to the Warlocks. And if they were doing the same as everyone else, it would jump up to like top 3. They're giving your entire raid, including you, a 5% increase from 100 to 80. And then from 80 to 0, you're not getting any increase at all. So for 1/5 of the fight, you're getting a 5% damage increase. Doesn't that mean that generally speaking, over an entire 100 to 0 fight, you are giving your raid 1% of their DPS? Yeah. I'm pretty sure you guys are saying no, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And then simply what I'm doing is just adding what they would have added to the raid on this log to the hunter. Just like what you could technically do if you were trying to determine a demon hunter's value to a raid, is you could be like, do we play the class that's better than the demon hunter, or do we see how much chaos brand adds? And then you do that math and you're like, oh, that's a ton. It's way better, right? All we're doing is determining raid spot viability based on this change. Like, here's the question, right? When you look at, let me pull up a sheet. When you look at classes that are required in a raid, like no matter what tuning exists, you have these classes in the raid. I'll pull up something to kind of explain how that is. So here are, generally speaking, raid buffs in this game, right? No matter what tuning is, you will want one monk, you will want a DH, you want druid for Mark of the Wild, you want priest because of fortitude, you want mage because of arcane intellect and some other things, you want locks because of gateways and hellstones. These are not an option, you need them. You want paladin for devotion aura, you want rogue for atrophic poison, you want warrior for battle shout, you want enhance for wind fury. Assuming that you're bringing a couple of these other classes already, the Wind Fury is going to just naturally gain good value with a normal raid comp. You want a second Paladin for Retribution Aura. You want an Evoker, not necessarily for any one specific thing. It's a combination of a lot of things. Like, they do bring a literal raid buff that reduces the cooldown slightly of your movement skills. But that, honestly, is like probably the weakest thing they give. If you look at their whole toolkit, they're just going to have a spot in your raid, regardless of tuning of augmentation, devastation, or preservation, because they just, I don't know, someone's going to need a rescue. Cauterizing Flame has crazy value. They're like infinite mobility. They're really tanky if played properly. So they just have like a lot of value, right? And then I put DK here just because historically this has been true. DKs don't literally have something that does what these classes do, but on fights where you need grips, which is historically like 1 to 2 to 3 fights a raid, they are required, and you need to have them to have gear for those fights, so you end up just playing them the whole time. They also technically have a like attack speed reduction if you want to talk about raid cooldown, which is Insidious Chill. You have to drop like AMZ runic power or something else that's like, or like the second charge of all this stuff to really get this, which is something you don't want to do. But, you know, worth mentioning that it exists. It's still pretty ass, not super important. We don't really think about Insidious Chill. We didn't run it all last raid, but you could technically say they have that. But I would say in most raids, DK fits on this list for grip is not relevant on every fight, but grip is more important than every single bit of this utility from these classes on some fights, and those fights always exist. So you always end up bringing a DK. All right, and then after that, you had nothing. Notable exclusions from this list, right? Ellie Shaman, or technically Resto as well, although Spirit Link does sometimes get them a raid spot, similar to DK, but just way less often. And you have Hunter, right? I don't have a Hunter color here, so I'm just going to type Hunter. Right, the question is, and why the only reason I'm kind of just doing some math in my head right now is to see if, generally speaking, Hunter gaining this, which you basically could equate this Mark of the Wild, or not Mark of the Wild, the Hunter's Mark thing to like DH or the Monk buff, right? Monk buff buffs physical damage by 5%. I mean, actually, Monk is way more. Monk is the best raid buff in the game. It gives you 5% phys damage, 8% increased healing, and 4% avoidance. It's turbo broken. No idea why they have that much. Let's just say DH, right? DH brings 5% magic damage. When you look at the raid damage breakdown in most raids, it's not quite 50-50. It's a little bit more. It's like 60% of your damage is magic. So that means that 5% is roughly like, you know, it's increasing your raid damage by like 2.6 or 2.7%, right? So it would make it like almost 3 times better than this Hunter's Mark thing. More like 75-25. Most of the time, yeah, when Demo's meta, a lot of their damage is physical from their Tyrant, right? Or for whatever reason, I know they have a ton of his damage. I don't know if that's true nowadays, though. But regardless, you know, it's going to give you like a 3% increase. It's not like it's not increasing your raid's DPS by 5. It's increasing it by like 3%. So this being not as good as that, but it's basically like, does this get value? Like, Demon Hunters technically don't need to be in the raid. What you could do, exactly what I'm doing now, you can say, okay, you're playing a Havoc DH or a Vengeance DH, and you're saying, how much more damage does X class do than Vengeance? Well, if you add the fact that they're the only class bringing a, 3% basically raid damage increase, there's no class that's going to realistically be able to compete for that. So does this put Hunter in the raid comp at all times, a 1% raid DPS increase, which, like I was pointing out here, would be, like roughly 20k DPS on this log, would move them all the way up here in a scenario where a demon or a BM Hunter is doing pretty low. I would say it's not going to be automatic, but in almost every raid, it is going to give them that spot. Because it doesn't just have that value. Like, for example, On Sarkareth, you can use it on the pull, and you're using all your CDs, you're blasting the boss, and all that damage is relevant for getting the boss to 0%. That is not always true, but it is on that fight. And then in P2, you can use it on the big ads that you have to kill anyway. So you're getting that value kind of constantly, even throughout the initial thing. So it's potentially even worth more, especially on any important target swapping. You'll have to do the math for any other classes as well. I'll go ahead and do it for you because we've done this many times in the past. We have almost not run Windwalker a few times because of how little physical damage is in the raid and how little damage monks did comparison to the best class, right? Like, for example, let's say, I'm just going to make this up. Let's say the monk buff in this raid scenario, ignore this Mistweaver, is only getting you the same thing, around 20k DPS. That actually wouldn't, actually wait, that would put them at number 1. But let's say it gave you 15k DPS, right? Or they did a little bit less damage. You could be like, we could bring a Windwalker, but actually if we just brought another person doing the same damage as this top guy, no matter what the class is, we actually wouldn't be gaining as much from the Windwalker buff, right? In this specific raid comp. Obviously, players are a different skill in every guild, but, you know, you get the point. Even on ads, it's only 1% additional damage. Yes, but 1% additional damage to the entire raid is big value, right? I would say if hunters are ever middle of the pack damage, this is going to basically give them the value of being number 1. So, which is, you know, like if you were to do that to a Havoc DH, they would always be number 1, which again is just showing you what actual value they're bringing. So I think fight dependent, but most of the time you're going to end up playing a hunter because of this. I think it could maybe be a little stronger because there are other classes that have similar buffs that are stronger, and that would just solidify it. Like, you just want a hunter all the time. But if you have a good hunter in your guild now and you ever felt like you might have to sit that player because of comps, which you probably shouldn't do, like comp reasons, like buff reasons, I think you bring that player all the time now, for sure. But just like most other classes, it doesn't help the second hunter. I think hunters are still lacking basic utility. A few other classes as well are lacking basic utility that a lot of these classes bring extra of. But I would say for 99% of guilds, including the Race to World First and 90+% of bosses, unless hunters are actually all 3 specs are bottom fragging, like if you look at like statistics and all 3 hunter specs are actually miserable and they're at the very bottom, in most raids, if you take 1% of the raid damage and add it on to whatever the best hunter spec is, they're going to be good enough to bring to all raid fights. So this is a major W for hunter. Probably could be better, but they've been waiting for this day for a long time. I think this puts like 1 hunter in your raid like almost always at the moment. I'll think about it more, but I've just did a quick little 15-minute think. I'm pretty sure hunters have 1 spot in the raid as of right now, which does interestingly point out that last expansion, it was like 5 specs that were heavily discluded because of raid buffs, and less people cared, or 5 classes, but less people cared because it was like, I don't know, there's other people like me who also don't bring anything to a raid, and there was less required raid buffs. Let's say there's 14 this expansion. Last expansion, it was like 7. So it's been increased by a ton this expansion. But now it's just only like 6 raid spots in an optimal world. Again, in an optimal world, you don't actually have to do this. Most top guilds will. I guess you could also say Ellie Resto, whatever. But like, basically non-Wind Fury Shamans are the only class that you do not need 1 of in a raid. It's like you need 1 Shaman in a raid, but it has to specifically be enhanced, which is weird. So that's the only thing. Now add the 3 other Augs. We're not making a raid comp for next tier. What we're discussing here is simply what is actually required in your raid comp. Aug is basically just full tuning. Aug is very simple. The way it works right now is you'll run, if Augs are not good enough, you'll run 0 of them. And if they are good enough, you'll run as many as you can. Because every augmentation evoker you're playing is also a class with cheat death. It's also a class with crazy utility, right? So like adding extra of them keeps adding their value rather than just needing 1. So you'll either see 0 or like, you know, 2, 3, or 4 or something. It totally depends on that. Also there is a world where playing Aug and Raid becomes infinitely more complicated with more than like 2 of them. So you might see some deterrent due to that, depending on how they design it. Because like, I'm just gonna tell you right now, if any guild you guys play in, Natty walks into a raid with 4 Aug evokers without a crazy amount of planning, you're going to end up doing worse because they're gonna have you're gonna be buffing augmentation evokers with Ebon Mites all the time, which is terrible value. And also, those players, if they're playing it properly, are going to be like doing harder stuff than everyone else. Like what you have to do with presence in a raiding environment to actually get the most out of augmentation possible, which is not just putting it on the same couple people the whole fight, is actually like turbo f***ing complicated. It's really, really annoying. So saying the whole like, oh, you're just gonna run a million of them, a lot of people won't, even if it's good, and you'll end up playing better because of it. By the way, someone said you can't use it on the same target. That's fine. I'm pretty sure only one hunter, all the hunters aren't going to want to be pressing this, and the scenario where you could just keep stacking this infinitely would be really weird. Like, you can't stack 2 Chaos Brands. Like, why would you be able to stack this? I mean, I obviously know it's less value than Chaos Brand, but it's the same concept, right?